I pay you to mop floors, not to stuff words into my son's head. Celeste Hawthorne's voice rang out cold as carved stone, echoing across the marble-floored grand hall of her $40 million mansion. She looked at the black woman crouching beside her son, the way one might glance at a stain that hadn't yet been cleaned up. The woman stood up, calm but not cowardly. Her name was Naomi Elridge, the housekeeper hired just 3 months ago, nearly invisible in this house. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Hawthorne, the boy only came near while I was working." Celeste stepped forward, each click of her heel resounding sharply in the hall. She looked Naomi over from head to toe, as if assessing a cheap object that had been misplaced in a luxury showroom. "Elias doesn't engage with anyone, he doesn't respond, he doesn't learn. Don't think you can change that just because he got curious for a few minutes." Naomi didn't argue, but in her eyes there was something else. Not defiance nor submission, it was the quiet of someone who understood, more than anyone else in that room, that the boy didn't need pity. He just needed to be seen the right way. Celeste turned away without another word, but the look in her eyes as she exited the hall was enough to extinguish any flicker of hope. Naomi knelt to pick up the cleaning cloth that had fallen beside Elias. The boy remained still, not looking at anyone, his hands flipping a page in a book. A picture of a cat appeared, with a small line of text underneath. "Il mio gatto si chiama Lino." She glanced at the line, then smiled faintly. If you've ever been underestimated because of the clothes you wear, the job you hold, or your place in society, stay with this story till the very end. And if you believe that patience and understanding can change a life, hit subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Naomi Elridge woke up at 4 a.m. every day. She was always the first to arrive at the mansion, and the last to leave the basement level after scrubbing it spotless. Her face was always clean, her voice as soft as wind gliding over glass, and her footsteps nearly silent. No one in the house really remembered when she had been hired. She simply was always there, quiet, invisible, like a nameless shadow. Only one person noticed her presence, Elias. The boy often sat in the far corner of the living room or on the steps near the library, hugging a book to his chest, not speaking, not touching anyone, as if the world itself had closed its doors on him. But Naomi noticed. Every time she softly murmured a line of Spanish while mopping the floor, Elias would lift his head just slightly. When she counted in French while folding linens, 1, 2, 3, his fingers would twitch faintly. And that morning, when Naomi sighed a phrase in Portuguese, "Tudo passa, meu amor." Everything passes, my love. Elias blinked twice, as if a small door had just creaked open inside his mind. Naomi realized he wasn't deaf, he wasn't unaware, he was just waiting for someone to speak to him, in a different rhythm, on a different frequency. And from that day forward, as she mopped floors, folded blankets, watered plants, Naomi began leaving small fragments of sound scattered across the house. An Italian phrase by the sink, a cluster of German words while arranging clothes, a quiet Japanese lullaby whispered near the stairway. She never looked at Elias, never spoke to him directly, but she knew he was listening, and for the first time in months, the boy no longer kept his head down. Elias began to look up, blink more, and hold sound longer in his gaze. Naomi didn't need proof. To her, just one child learning to listen again was more than enough. Celeste Hawthorne was not the kind of woman who tolerated what she couldn't control. That day, she stepped into the reading room, and the first image that struck her eyes was Elias holding an Italian picture book. He sat upright on the rug, his gaze no longer dull but sharply focused on the pages, studying the animal illustrations and the unfamiliar words beneath them. Naomi stood a few steps away, a cleaning cloth in her hand. She hadn't touched the boy, but to Celeste, that was already too much. "I was very clear. I don't want you near Elias." Naomi straightened her back, her eyes calm, unflinching. "I didn't go near him. He came near me." "And why is that?" Celeste's voice sharpened. "Why is my son sitting here reading an Italian book?" "I found it in the library. I only placed it back on the shelf. Elias picked it up himself." Celeste marched forward and yanked the book out of her son's hands. He can't learn. He can't understand. 3 top doctors have said so. You're not a specialist. You're a maid. And I want you away from my son. That sentence was no longer a warning. It was a command. A full stop. Naomi simply nodded. She didn't protest. The mistress of the house had drawn a line. But what Celeste didn't understand was that once a child begins to listen again, being forced back into silence can be the cruelest thing of all. Naomi stepped back and left the room. Elias remained seated, his hand lightly touching the spot where the book had just been. The Hawthorne mansion was usually quiet in the afternoons. Only the ticking of the grandfather clock echoed through the halls, accompanied by the faint, distant strains of a classical symphony that Celeste always played, out of habit, more than enjoyment. Naomi Elridge continued her work as usual. She no longer stepped close to Elias. She didn't look him in the eye, but each time she passed by, she would hum a few soft words. Not loudly, just enough for the boy to hear, if he wanted to. That day, as she wiped the floor near the library door, Naomi whispered a single sentence in French, very gently. C'est un chat. Il est très doux. This is a cat. He is very gentle. She didn't expect anything. It had become a habit, a quiet offering to a soul still asleep. Then she heard it. A whisper, softer than the wind, but unmistakably clear. Merci, madame. Thank you, ma'am. Naomi looked up. Elias was looking at her, not flinching, not afraid, just seeing her. For the first time in 2 years, the boy had spoken. At that exact moment, Celeste walked in. She froze. Her eyes widened. Her chest rose and fell, as if she had just been yanked out of a world she'd long accepted would never hold sound again. Elias, she whispered, did you just speak? Elias turned toward her, calm. He looked at his mother for 1 second, then turned back to his book, flipping to the next page. Naomi remained still. She said nothing. She didn't smile. She wasn't proud. She simply bore witness to what she had always known would come. Because children like Elias, they aren't broken. They're just waiting for someone to knock on the right door. The next morning, Naomi was summoned to Celeste Hawthorne's private office. There was no greeting, no offer to sit, only a cold stare, and a walnut desk covered in files, flanked by photos from charity galas where Celeste had once been honored as Humanitarian Mother of the Year. Celeste spoke first, her voice emotionless. What happened yesterday was a coincidence. Naomi remained silent. Elias occasionally utters meaningless sounds. People mistake them for words. That same tone, calm, composed, yet steeped in denial. Naomi didn't argue. She simply gave a slight nod. She knew this was not the time for debate. I want you to focus on the basement and storage areas, Celeste continued. Sandra will take over cleaning the rooms where Elias usually stays. A quiet, calculated exile. Celeste didn't raise her voice. She merely removed the disruption from her comfort zone. Naomi folded her hands in front of her. I understand, Mrs. Hawthorne. She bowed her head slightly and left the office. Not a word of protest. But in her eyes, there was nothing submissive. Only one thing remained, an unshakable belief in that child. Behind the closed door, Celeste sat motionless. She kept replaying the words in her mind like a mantra. 3 neurologists confirmed it. The boy cannot speak. There's no way, not because of a few whispered words. Because if what happened yesterday was real, then for the past 2 years, as a mother, she had been wrong. That afternoon, as Naomi was organizing boxes of cleaning supplies in the basement storeroom, she heard slow footsteps descending the stairs. It was Dr. Gabriel Yates, the Hawthorne family's private pediatrician. He stopped at the bottom step, his expression polite but hesitant. I'm sorry if I'm intruding. I need to speak with you. About Elias. Naomi set the box down, gave a slight nod. I'm listening, doctor. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. Yesterday, when I happened to pass by and heard Elias speak, that wasn't random noise. It was a linguistic response, intentional, directed. Naomi said nothing. She simply looked him in the eye, calm but quietly expectant. I've been a doctor for over 20 years. I know the difference between a child making uncontrolled sounds and one trying to communicate. There was a long pause. Then he asked, "You have a background in special education, don't you?" Naomi hesitated. For the first time, she weighed whether to open the door to her past or keep living behind it. Finally, she answered without embellishment, "I hold a PhD in applied linguistics from Columbia University. I used to teach and research cognitive language development in neurodivergent children." Dr. Yates froze slightly. He looked at Naomi as if seeing an entirely different person. "You're Dr. Naomi Elridge, the one who wrote the paper on selective mutism for child neurocognition quarterly?" Naomi nodded. "I've worked with 43 children who were misdiagnosed. 38 of them now study and communicate fluently, in 2 or 3 languages." Dr. Yates was quiet for a long moment. Then he spoke, more softly. "Elias has an appointment with me tomorrow morning. Celeste wants to increase his medication because she thinks he's hallucinating. I don't think he needs more meds, he needs a chance." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a business card. On the back, he wrote a number by hand. "This is my private line, if you're willing to help this boy. I'll take care of the medical side and monitoring, but everything must remain completely discreet." Naomi took the card, gave a quiet nod, her eyes steady, and for the first time since stepping into this mansion, she no longer felt alone. Ever since her meeting with Dr. Yates, Naomi no longer worked on instinct. She made a plan. At night in the cramped staff quarters, she spread out printouts from emails sent by Professor James Alder. Pages of research, behavior analysis charts, response-level intervention diagrams, all marked meticulously with colored pencils. No one in the house knew that the small basement room had become a miniature research lab. Naomi didn't act in haste. She carefully documented every small reaction Elias had in a notebook, lifted his head at the sound of French, eyes tracked repeated Spanish phrases, no response to Russian, smiled faintly at the melody of a classical Japanese tune. From those notes, she built a personalized program, one she silently named Layered Oral Response Intervention, Elias Protocol. No one knew that Naomi had written a near-identical research proposal 6 years ago, only to have it dismissed by a review board for lack of sufficient real-world testing. Now Naomi began quietly introducing the first lessons into Elias's world, not with alphabets, but with emotional objects: a cat, water, wind, light, concepts that evoked safety. She embedded vocabulary from multiple languages into familiar objects. A picture of a fish labeled with fish, poisson, pêche, fish, pêche, riba. An alphabet chart printed onto a tablecloth. A handwritten Japanese lullaby tucked into the drawer of an old desk. No instruction, no demands. Naomi knew Elias didn't need pressure. He just needed a space quiet enough for his own mind to speak. Morning sunlight streamed through the tall window, spilling into Elias's room like a ribbon of silk. On the floor, the boy sat cross-legged, his head bowed intently over a picture book filled with bright illustrations. It was the book Naomi had left under his bed. A simple but special storybook, each image was labeled with its corresponding word in 6 different languages. Elias turned to the page with a picture of a cat. He touched each word with the tip of his finger. Cat, chat, gato, katsa, neko, koshka. Each word emerged as a soft sound, but clear and deliberate. There was no prompting, no one standing beside him, no rewards or pressure. It was simply a child discovering his first joy in naming the world around him. In the hallway, Naomi walked slowly past his room. She didn't look in. She didn't pause. But in that fleeting moment, she smiled. A smile so subtle, almost no one would ever notice. She didn't need to stand beside Elias to teach. All she had to do was plant the seed in the right place. And the rest, the boy would grow on his own. Downstairs, Marilyn Cross, the housekeeper. overheard a few soft words drifting from Elias's room. Katze, Koshka. She furrowed her brow, her face tightened with a strange mix of emotions. Curiosity, suspicion. Or was it envy? Naomi didn't know that on that very morning, another quiet resistance had begun. From someone who didn't want to see her rise beyond the title of housemaid. Marilyn Cross had always believed she understood the unspoken rules of the mansion. Stay silent, stay loyal, and never overstep. To her, Naomi Elridge was an anomaly. A housemaid who never gossiped, never complained, never indulged in small talk, always meticulous, and somehow had drawn the attention of Elias. Marilyn didn't like that, and that morning she heard what she considered the final catalyst. Naomi was speaking softly on the phone, tucked away in the laundry area. "Can you send me the updated protocol draft? I want to test the 3-step dual-syllable response model." "Yes, the 7-year-old. He's showing clear indicators already." Marilyn held her breath. She didn't catch the full conversation, but words like protocol, model, and indicators were enough to enrage her. In her mind, Naomi was no longer just a maid, but a threat trying to climb above her station, trying to get close to the mistress's son by pretending to be smart. Right after lunch, Marilyn marched to Celeste Hawthorne's office door, her face grave, her voice adopting the tone she used when reporting an incident. "Mrs. Hawthorne, I think there's something you should know about the maid." Celeste didn't look up. "What now, Marilyn?" "Last night I happened to overhear her on the phone. She mentioned academic materials, intervention models, and even a university." Celeste froze mid-page. "What university?" "Columbia, Mom. And she mentioned something about 40-something children like young Elias." "I don't think she is who we believe she is." Celeste's eyes chilled, the puzzle pieces in her mind, the strange words coming from Elias, Naomi's quiet defiance, even Dr. Yates's increasing secrecy, suddenly began to snap together in an unsettling way. "Bring her to my office, now." Marilyn nodded and turned away, a flicker of a smile playing at the corner of her lips. She thought she had just regained control. But what Marilyn didn't know was this. There are some truths that once brought into the light can never be buried again. Naomi stepped into Celeste Hawthorne's office. The room, once elegant, now felt suffocating. Celeste didn't offer a seat. She simply turned her laptop around, revealing an open file on the screen. In the top left corner, a photo of Naomi wearing her Columbia graduation gown. Below it, a bold headline, "Dr. Naomi Elridge, Specialist in Applied Linguistics, Columbia University." On the right, a list of research publications on autism, international keynote addresses, and academic awards. Celeste gripped the edge of the desk. "You wrote language mirrors in silent children." Naomi didn't flinch. "Yes, that paper is part of the undergraduate curriculum in 9 countries." "Why didn't you tell me?" Naomi gave a faint, sad smile. "Because I knew you'd never ask." Celeste stared at her. "You could have worked at any institute. Why here?" "Because I needed a job to pay for my mother's medication, and because I don't give up on children, no matter where they are." "You kept this from me, from my son." Naomi replied slowly and clearly, "I never deceived you. But I also couldn't shout just to be believed." Silence fell. The power in the room seemed to shift. Celeste lifted her hands from the desk. Her voice softened. "I underestimated you." Naomi simply looked at her. No resentment, no pride. Just the calm of someone who no longer needed validation. A knock came at the door. Dr. Gabriel Yates entered, followed by Elias. The boy clutched a book in his arms, his eyes radiant. And then Celeste saw it. The dullness in her son's gaze was gone. If you sense something is beginning to change, don't look away, because what comes next will be beyond belief. Subscribe to the channel to follow the rest of this story. In the office that had once been the center of control, Celeste Hawthorne now sat in silence. On the desk, Dr. Yates played the first video. Elias sat at a small table, counting to 10 in German. Eins, zwei, drei. The second video, Elias recited the Mandarin alphabet, his pronunciation nearly flawless. The third video, the boy sang a children's song in Arabic with such fluid melody that even Naomi was momentarily stunned. He doesn't just speak, Dr. Yates said slowly. He absorbs systematically, distinguishes tonal patterns, and responds like a natural language learner. In the corner of the room, Elias was playing with a puzzle. Suddenly, he turned toward Celeste, walked over and spoke. In English, his voice clear and steady. "Mama, Naomi said I'm not broken. I just needed to be understood." Then, in Italian, he continued, "Lei mi ha insegnato a parlare." She taught me how to speak. Celeste dropped to her knees, her eyes reddening. How long had it been since she'd heard the word mama, spoken by her own child? Elias continued, this time in French, then seamlessly switched to Portuguese. The room seemed to stop breathing. Naomi stood quietly behind them, still holding the worn notebook in her hands. "Elias isn't a miracle," she said softly. "He was just never spoken to the right way. That's not a miracle. That's a basic right." Celeste reached out and touched her son's face, and for the first time in 2 years, she felt something return. Not just speech, not just cognition, but the light in Elias's eyes. Night had fallen. In the villa's living room, only the warm golden glow from the fireplace lit the space. Elias sat on the floor drawing, while Naomi quietly put away books. Celeste stood nearby. She didn't know why she hadn't left yet, maybe because, for the first time in years, she was watching her son truly live. Elias suddenly paused. He looked at Naomi, then turned to his mother. "Mama?" Celeste flinched. It had been so long since she'd heard that word. From her son's own voice. Elias continued slowly, this time not in French, not in Spanish, but in English. Clear, honest, and full of hesitation. "I used to try. A lot. But every time I tried, you got sad." Naomi froze. "You didn't yell, but you looked away, and I thought you didn't want to hear me." Celeste's voice cracked. "That's not true, Elias. I was afraid to hope. Afraid I'd be disappointed again." Elias lowered his head and whispered, "So I stayed quiet. So you wouldn't be sad anymore." An invisible blade sliced through Celeste's chest. She dropped to her knees in front of her son, her hands trembling as they rested on his shoulders. "No, Elias, I was sad because I thought you were in pain. But if you can speak, even just one word, that would be the greatest gift I've ever received." Elias looked at his mother, and for the first time, he reached out and gently wiped her tears. Naomi quietly stepped out of the room, leaving mother and son in an embrace. Not of regret, but of healing. The door closed softly behind her, and in the soft crackle of the fireplace, an old chapter came to an end. The next morning, Naomi Elridge was packing her things. She knew, after everything, she couldn't stay in this house any longer. Even if Celeste hadn't formally dismissed her, the truth was already clear. She folded each notebook, each faded lecture printout, each worn language flashcard. A soft knock sounded at the door. Celeste Hawthorne stood there, no longer in her usual commanding power suit, but in a thin cardigan, her hair tied back in a loose bun. She looked tired but honest. Naomi began to greet her, but Celeste interrupted. "I don't need you to stay, as a housemaid." Naomi bowed slightly. "I understand." Celeste stepped forward, her eyes misty but resolute. "I need you to stay as my son's teacher." Naomi looked up. A heavy silence filled the room. Celeste took a deep breath. "You've done what 3 top doctors couldn't. You didn't just teach Elias to speak, you taught him to believe in himself. I saw you as a shadow, a cleaner, someone beneath notice. But now I understand. Elias wasn't the one who couldn't speak. I was the one who didn't know how to listen." From her pocket, Celeste pulled out a simple contract. "I've created an official position within my education foundation, with compensation fitting your credentials, and more importantly, full autonomy." Naomi didn't respond right away. She glanced at the table, where Elias was scribbling a mixture of Chinese characters, Portuguese, and English. Then she gave a soft nod. I'm not staying for you. I'm staying because the boy needs me. And I've never walked away from a child halfway through. Celeste smiled faintly, then lowered her head. For the first time in her life, offering an apology not in words, but in action. Two women, once from worlds apart, now stood in the same room, for the same reason the child named Elias. A new sign was erected in front of the Hawthorne estate, the Elias Institute for Language and Light, where every silence holds a voice. Every corner of the house had been transformed. No longer a quiet mansion for the ultra-wealthy, but now a free language rehabilitation center for autistic children from across the United States. On YouTube, the channel Learning with Elias had just passed 2.4 million subscribers. Elias, now fluent in 9 languages, shared weekly short lessons, helping children find their first words again. International media dubbed it the non-pharmaceutical language therapy revolution. At the Global Education Summit in Toronto, Celeste Hawthorne took the stage, for the first time not as a pharmaceutical CEO, but simply as Elias's mother. She didn't deliver a speech. Instead, she introduced someone. Naomi Elridge, in a simple button-up shirt, holding a stack of documents, stepped onto the podium. The entire hall rose in a standing ovation. Not for her credentials, but for what she had awakened. Hope. Naomi smiled, her voice quiet. But each word struck straight to the hearts of those listening. I didn't heal. I just listened. Because sometimes children don't need explanations. They just need someone patient enough to stay. Cut to the mansion, where a little boy pointed to different national flags, naming each country in a different language. Elias paused at the final flag. He turned to the camera and said, "We all speak different words, but we feel the same." A peaceful scene inside a classroom at the Elias Institute. Naomi Elridge sat by the window, gently folding handwritten letters from parents in Brazil, South Korea, and Egypt, all thanking her because their child had whispered their first words after years of silence. Across the room, Elias, now 8 years old, was preparing to speak at the First Words Day ceremony for a new group of children. Celeste Hawthorne sat in the front row, no longer the busy billionaire, but a quiet mother clutching a white handkerchief, just like the one she held the day Elias first said, "Mama." The lights softened. Elias stepped up to the podium, holding a small sheet of paper. People often call what I did a miracle, but I don't think it is. I just needed someone who didn't leave, someone who believed I was listening even when I didn't speak. That person didn't break the box I was hiding in. They showed me that the box never really existed. He paused, looking toward Naomi. "Thank you, Miss Elridge." Naomi's cheeks were wet with tears. Celeste reached over and gently held her hand, no longer as employer and housemaid, but as two women who had carried a single fragile flame through the dark. Final scene, Elias, Naomi, and Celeste walked together across the schoolyard, surrounded by dozens of children, practicing the first words of their lives. A final message fades onto the screen. Your voice isn't something you're born with. It's something you find again when someone truly listens. There are children who don't speak, not because they can't, but because the world has become too loud to hear their whispers. There are people who remain silent, not because they are invisible, but because they've been labeled by their job, their skin color, or their social status. Naomi Elridge didn't shout to prove her worth. She simply stayed and listened. Elias Hawthorne didn't need to be healed with titles, medicine, or expensive clinics. He just needed someone to believe that his voice was still there, waiting to be found. And Celeste, the once cold mother, didn't need a miracle. She just needed to understand correctly in order to begin again. Because sometimes the only thing we truly need to do is to stop judging someone by what they don't say. Don't look away. If this story touched you, subscribe to the channel and follow more heartfelt, powerful undercover journeys. Because sometimes the person who changes the world starts with a whisper. Silence doesn't mean absence. and every voice deserves to be heard. When someone is patient enough to truly listen,